All right, well, this week we are in the second part of a series called Doubt, and we're talking about doubt. So it's not the most creative title we've come up with for a series, but at least you know what we're talking about. The way we defined doubt, we're only in part 2. So the way we defined doubt last week, what we said is doubt really is the feeling, the emotion that comes with uncertainty. Like on a general level, in any field of life, it's the feeling of uncertainty. And so if we're talking about the feeling of certainty or having complete confidence, like the absence of doubt, if you want to know what that feels like, think about the way you feel about your chair right now, right? Hopefully. When you sat down, probably you weren't like questioning. You're probably not distracted by it right now. Like, am I gonna make it through the rest of this service? You know, it's a pretty strong chair. It's gonna be able to hold you up. You should be confident in it, right? There's really no doubt. It's complete like certainty. In fact, you weren't even thinking about it because there's no reason to, right? But doubt, the feeling of uncertainty, for me, it's like shaky. So if I were to take this water bottle and like put it like that, there's a little bit of uncertainty with that situation, right? I don't know, I'm not sure. You know, if I were to just continue like this, that is gonna be demanding your attention like over and over and over again. Is it gonna make it? Is it gonna fall? And I know some of you are like just hoping it goes down. It might, right? It might, but it really it pulls you from where you are out of concern. It's unstable. There's one person who says that doubt, it's like being thrown in the waves. I don't know, I'm not sure. Let's put this back. It's uncomfortable. It's the feeling of uncertainty. Now, when that feeling, when it enters into the church, when we start talking about God, Jesus, church, this whole thing, a lot of times the feeling of doubt brings a friend with it, right? There's another emotion that often comes along, and sometimes that feeling is guilt, right? Like I'm not totally sure about what they said or what I read or what I'm hearing, and I feel like I really should believe it, you know, but I don't. And so we feel guilty. Or maybe it's a feeling of shame, like I'm not quite being where you should. I'm not measuring up, your faith not being enough, feeling like you're never gonna be one of those people who could just believe, right? And so that comes with it. Or maybe it's even anger and frustration, discouragement, right? It feels different, but it also looks different for different people. If you were here last week, you know I told you there was a time where like I just doubted. I had a difficult time believing the whole thing. And I come into services like this and I'd look around and just be like, are these people serious? Like they really think there's someone listening up there? And it would be frustrating to me. It was a feeling I actually like felt angry. And maybe that's you. Maybe that was you just a couple minutes ago as we were singing, right? Or maybe you're kind of on board. You know, there's some things you're like, all right, I like some of this. I can wrap my mind around some of it. But then there are just certain things that are said. There's certain aspects about this whole thing where I can't do that. You know, and so it's like doubt applied to specific things. And that's often where we can start to feel guilty. And so we feel the need to just like not think about it, hope no one mentions it. We'll pretend we believe when it comes up. We'll suppress it. We'll ignore it. And maybe you want to, but you just can't believe it. And then at other times, especially if you're someone who's been in the church for a long time, maybe you have very few doubts, but every once in a while, in the quiet places, maybe you're in bed at night, in the shower, in the car, alone, it just like creeps in. What if this is all just made up? All this whole thing I've trying to build my life around, my peace around, my joy, my hope. What if it's just a big hoax? And so the question is, well, what do we do with that? You know, this series really isn't about necessarily putting any one of your doubts to rest, but rather like having the tools to know what to do when we're faced with doubt, because you will be at some point if you haven't wrestled with doubt already. How do we handle, how do we see, feel, approach, and deal with doubt when it shows up in our lives? And my hope for you is that if you're someone who considers themselves a follower of Jesus, a person of faith, a Christian, however you want to say it, that these for you will be like tools that you have in your belt when doubt comes up. Ways that you can handle it, navigate the difficulties and complexities of doubt. And if you're not, if you don't believe at all, if you're not on board, what I suggested last week, and what I'll repeat again today, is that maybe, if you're like me, at least, maybe knowing how God wants you to feel when you doubt, like that might just be enough to pull you in the direction of faith. So kind of to lay the foundation last week, we said that what you need to understand going into this, like at square one, is simply that it's okay to doubt. We talked about a guy named John the Baptist who was the most dedicated, loyal, faithful follower of Jesus. He was one of the first ones. He was doing it for the longest, super passionate, on fire. Like the guy was totally in. His whole life he devoted to this whole message. And at the end of the life, he sends his followers to be like, just go see if Jesus is really who he said he was. He doubts. He has an issue with doubt. And when Jesus is asked, not only does he answer John's question, but he turns around, he brags about him to the crowd. He says, there's no one greater than John the Baptist. As if to say, like, he's still cool with me. His doubts didn't discredit his faith. And you need to know that. You need to know that because you will doubt. And if you feel like, well, now the whole thing is out the window, it will all come falling down. It's okay to doubt. Your doubts don't discredit your faith. Or we said the tool that you can have in your belt is when it comes to doubt, you should be aware of them. But don't be ashamed of them. Because if you're ashamed, you'll suppress, you'll pretend, you'll ignore. And one day, it'll all explode. So, in the time that we have left, here's the thing I want you to think about. Have you ever been told, like, just believe? And genuinely wanted to? Like, do you ever wish you could just believe? Like, flip a switch. As if it were as black and white, as clear and simple as being like, raise your hand, sure. Right? Like, there have been times I've been told to just believe, and I get like all my believe muscles, right? And with everything I have, but I can't. And it's like, if I could, I would, but I can't, so I don't. Right? You ever been there? Or maybe you know some people that can. It seems like, maybe you've heard these stories before, and maybe this is your story too, and there's nothing wrong with this, but there's someone, who's like, oh, I just heard and I believed, and I never looked back. I was walking to 7-Eleven, I was gonna get my Slurpee, coffee, whatever you get at 7-Eleven. Someone came up to me, they told me about Jesus, and it was like, I'm in, I'm on board. We hear and we believe, Maybe that's your story. I hear stories like that, and sometimes it was frustrating. But there are really two things that rose to the surface for me. When I would hear that, hear, believe, never look back. My life has been changed in a moment, just like that, right outside 7-Eleven. One, I'd be like, I wish that was me. I wish I could, but I can't. And two, I thought God must love these people. Okay, he's God, so he loves everyone, right? But maybe there's a special place on his fridge for people that can believe stuff like this. Just boom, he's looking down there they are, just believe and never doubt and love those people. So if that's the first group of people, for me, I was in the second group of people. I would hear, and I still am a little like this. I'm a lot like this. I would hear and question, scrutinize, find fault. Like, just I'll put it under a microscope. Like, someone would tell me something, be like, really? And I'm not even just talking about church. I'm talking about anything. I want to know. I got to see for myself if there's anything to what you're saying. Like, not too long ago, I was watching a YouTube video, which is great. It's really down a rabbit hole. And I came across this guy. He's a handyman. So he's got all these videos about fixing sinks and doors. Then there's one video about, like, him figuring out how to get the best sleep he's ever gotten. I'm like, well, this is interesting. So I clicked on it, and he said, the secret is, he's like, I had all these tests done, always had trouble sleeping. The secret is to go to sleep and tape your mouth shut. And then you'll be forced to breathe through your nose. He's like, best sleep of my life. And I heard this, and I'm like, well, I mean, if he can fix my kitchen sink, he probably could tell me how to get a better night's sleep. No, I heard it and I was like, I don't know about that, right? But I tried it. I'm sorry, I just got to see for myself. I'm questioning it. I want to get my hands around it, right? And so I did. And long story short, I don't really know if it works because I usually wake up and the tape's off my mouth, and I don't know how it happens. So, but I got to try. And if I can't try, I question. I scrutinize. I want to hit you with all the questions. And when I was growing up in the church world, there was this subtle pressure to not question. Like, can you just go with it? Just play along. And if I'm being honest, I just never felt like that was okay. No. Because if you're asking me to build my life around something, to actually have internal peace and real hope and joy because of what you're saying, and I've got questions and can't ask those questions, then I can't go along with it. I'm not willing to. Or there's just this pressure to feel like just pretend it's all true. There was a guy, you've probably heard of him before if you've been here. His name's Paul. He came right after Jesus. Some people call him Saint Paul. He was Saul before he was Paul, Saul of Tarsus. He started all these churches. He totally bought into the message of Jesus, went around and shared this message with a lot of different people. And he got all these different responses. And there's this one place that he goes to, and people buy in pretty quickly. They're known as the Thessalonians. They're from a place called Thessalonica, right? And here's what happens. I'll read it for you. This is recorded by someone Paul traveled with. His name's Luke. He says this. It says, then they came to Thessalonica. This is Paul and his friend, buddy, Silas, right? They're sharing the good news about Jesus. They would go to Thessalonica where there was a Jewish synagogue. It says, as it was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days, he reasoned with them from the scriptures. Now, he went into the synagogue on a pretty regular basis because it was convenient. Synagogues were set up similar to this, so it was an easy place to teach. He would go in there, and in there were Jewish people. And so he was teaching those Jewish people the message about Jesus. And so he reasoned with them with the scriptures. It says, he was explaining and proving that the Messiah, talking about Jesus, had to suffer and rise from the dead. His message was this. He said, this Jesus I'm proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. And in result, some of the Jews were persuaded and they joined Paul and Silas. Thanks, 3 weeks, they're in, He gives them the message, they're persuaded, they're like, we like this guy, we're in. It's a pretty easy crowd, I'm assuming, to talk to. They get it, they believe him, they grasp the message, and some of them we're on board with you. This is group number 1, right? This is hear and believe. They're persuaded. They're like, all right, we're in, And so we don't know how God feels about these people. I mean, we know he loves them, but we know Paul really liked them. In fact, people who study this stuff would say that the Thessalonians were Paul's favorite people. He wrote 2 letters to them. We have them if you have a Bible. It's in the New Testament. It's called 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. In there, he just gushes over them. He's like, you guys are the best. I'm praying we'll meet up again. I brag about you to everyone. He is crazy about them. I think it's because they just believed what he said. It was a very easy crowd to talk to. Hear, believe. Well, he leaves there There were some people who didn't believe. They gave him a really hard time. But he left there and he went to another city. And when he got to this place, they heard and they did something. I'll teach you a word. This is the original language. It's in what we call Koine Greek. The word is anakrino. Let's say it together. Anakrino. Very good. All right. Now, this is not a great way of forming a definition, but sometimes it's helpful. This word it's the idea of ana, up, and to judge. What they did was take what they heard from him and hold it up against what they believed to be true. This word you can translate to question, to scrutinize, to look at it like under a microscope, or to find fault, like in the court of law. It's often used in a negative way, like to try and find holes in someone's argument. And so Paul goes from one place where they're like, all right, we're in, we love you, we're great, you write us some letters, Paul. And the other place, he gives them a message. They're like, yeah, we don't know. We're not sure. And we're told that over and over again, every day they go home and they study to see if what he said was true. Like, let's see if there's anything to what this guy says. I'll read you what the passage actually says. It says, now the Berean Jews, remember he's in the synagogue, so he's dealing with Jews from this place, Berea. He says, they were of more noble character. This word could also be translated noble-minded. Like they functioned on a better level. Than who? He says, than those in Thessalonica. Why? Like, is it because they showered them with candy and compliments when they got there? Luke, who's recording this, says it's because they received the message with great eagerness. This word means openness, like, okay, let's hear it. And they examined. There's anakrino. They questioned, they scrutinized, they tried to find fault, and they held it up against the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. Now, they did it with the scriptures because they were Jewish people, and that's what they had come to believe was true. And so what they're doing, they're hearing, they're listening, they're questioning, they're going home, and they're trying to figure out if this whole message holds any weight. And Luke, who's writing this, is saying, this is the better way. This is the better way. Not just taking it at face value, not that that's a bad thing, but he's saying, this is the better way of doing it. To look at it under a microscope, to try and find fault with it and see if it actually can hold weight. And you know what's amazing? As a result, you'd think they come back and say, like, as a result, no one listened to Paul because they found all the holes in his argument. But it says the exact opposite. As a result, many of them believed. They went home and they were like, there's something to this. This could be real. And they got on board. They hear, they question, they scrutinize, they try to find fault. But then they believe. Now, there's a word that I mentioned earlier. It's the word eagerness, right? It doesn't just mean they were like super excited. It means they were open-minded, like they were ready. They were ready. So they were critical, but they weren't cynical. They weren't just sitting there like shooting everything down, trying to poo-poo everything that came out of Paul's mouth. They were open-minded, genuinely wanting to learn. Then they took what they heard and they held it under a microscope to see if there was anything to it. And they found that there was something to it. And so for the sake of like the tools we're putting in our little doubt belt here, we could say when it comes to your doubts, your questions, you're like, I'm not sure. We can say, engage your doubts. Don't ignore them. Like dive in. You're not sure about something, grab your doubts by the horns. Luke, who's writing this, would say, this is the better way to do it. This is the better way. And you'll see whether or not this thing can hold weight. This is the better way to go. You know, in some like church circles, maybe you've even grown up in a church background like this, there's this pressure, and maybe you've even heard it from somebody in the front that's like, just believe. I'm telling you something, you take my word for it. Just believe, just believe. And what we're left with is kind of like this blind faith. This faith that we're just believing because someone told us to believe. And often that kind of faith can't really stand up against anything that's thrown at it. Jesus told a parable, which is a story that teaches a lesson, right? He told a story and he was like, all right, the message that I'm teaching, it's like a farmer spreading seed. And he gives a few different examples, like the different types of soil where the seed lands being different types of people and the different way that people hear. And he says there's some seed will fall on good soil. Like it'll sink in. It'll develop roots. It'll grow and it'll multiply. It's like that's someone who's ready to hear the message. But then he says there's this other group, there's a few other groups, but one of the other ones, he says there's seed that falls on shallow soil. And it lands and it sprouts. It's like, cool. He says, in its joy, it believes. It's like, I'm a plant, great. But he's like, it's on shallow soil and it's got no root. And so it withers because there was nothing to it. The doubts that you might currently have, that you're just like suppressing, trying not to think about, hoping you don't hear anything about on the History Channel and no one mentions to you, those doubts, if you engage them, may end up being the roots that secure your faith. You might see that this, as a result, may lead to belief. But it won't happen if you just ignore them, if you feel like you have to just believe. There's something else, though, that I think is interesting here. You know, the Bereans, they don't believe Paul, the deliverer of the message. They believe the message, and Paul pointed them to that message. Right? So think about it like this. Like imagine I'm up here and I'm like, hey, Oreos, best cookie in the world. And you're like, all right, amen. Next week, let's sing the Oreo song. And you know, Oreos, tattoos, we love Oreos, we'll be the Oreo club, okay? You can do that. You can do that. You take my word for it. Or I could say Oreos are the best cookies in the world. And you could be like, all right, I'll hear you out, but I got to see for myself. And you go down to Stop and Shop, and you can get a sleeve of Oreos. You can eat them for yourself, maybe even some Chips Ahoy, and figure out, okay, is there something to this? And if you eat those Oreos and you come to the conclusion that they are the best cookies in the world, that will be your belief, not mine. Because what might happen is if you take my word for it, and then one day you find out I changed my mind, what happens to your faith? Right? Like if you've been watching the news or you're like, you keep up with stuff like this, you know there are leaders in the church that are just going down over and over and over again. And what's happening is that people are going down with them. And the reason why is because a lot of these people are simply believing the messenger, not the message. They're never making it their own. And so when he goes down or she goes down, they go down with him because their faith was in what was coming out of their mouth, not something they went and believed for themselves. That they put their own, like through their own questions and scrutiny. This is huge. This is huge. And so what Luke is doing here is actually commending them for not taking Paul's word and going and finding the answer out on their own. And I would say the same thing for here. You hear me say something? Don't take my word for it. Like I wanted to point you in a direction, but you've got to go and make it your own. Because if one day something happens to me, and your faith is, especially if you're new to church, is just in something that I said, then that's going to go out the window as I go out the window. Engage your doubts. Don't ignore them. All right, so here's the image that I want to leave you with. So about 2 weeks ago, my wife, Allie, decided to go out for the night. And so I had the kids to myself. And I put the kids to bed right about 8 o'clock. I put the kids to bed. Also have the dog to myself. Put the kids to bed, tuck them in, say goodnight, turn off the lights. Now it's just me, home alone, right? And so I decided, since Allie's not here, I'm going to bed, living the life, right? Going to bed early. And so I did. It was great. I put my dog in her crate, shut everything down. It's like very early. I go to sleep. Well, Allie comes home a little while later, and all the lights are out in the house. She's thinking like, all right, that's weird. She walks inside, and she sees the dog is away, and she looks at the dog that's in our bedroom right next to my bed, and she said it looked like she was looking across the room, like into the playroom. And now she starts to get nervous, like there's someone else in the house. And then she walks into our bedroom, and she sees me in bed, and she pulls back the covers, and she sees me laying there with my eyes closed. It was amazing. She's like, I thought you were dead. You know, what would be ridiculous is if she saw what she saw, right? Like, she walked into the house believing everything was okay. But then she was confronted with some evidence that created some doubt. She could have chosen to ignore those doubts, ignore the tape over my face, the lights out, and get in bed and try to sleep. And just hope that this didn't amount to anything, right? But she probably wouldn't sleep well. Or she could have gone the other way, right? She could have seen the evidence that she saw and grabbed the kids, called the police, run out of the house, and start planning my funeral. But she didn't. She didn't do either of those things. She looked at me and she shoved me. And she was like, I need to see if you were still breathing. And I was, but it was just out my nose. Some of you have seen sufficient evidence in your lives. There have been some things you've seen that have created doubt. Maybe it's a leader whose faith has bombed, or people of faith that you know that are hypocritical, or maybe something you saw on TV, or something a professor told you in the classroom, but something that all of a sudden created some doubt. And I know there's some of you that are sticking with it, but you're in bed just hoping that it doesn't turn into anything, that there's no truth to it. And you don't want to think about it, you don't want it to come up, but you're just sitting there trying to have some peace. But you can't. And then there are others of you that have seen the same evidence and have planned the funeral of your faith. Like, I'm done. When really what you need to do is give your doubts a shove. See, like, is there anything to this? Even though the evidence might point one way, maybe it's not what it appears to be. And if you're willing to engage your doubts and you refuse to ignore them, what I think that you might see is that just like the Bereans, in result, I think you might end up believing seeing that this really can hold weight. But don't take my word for it. See for yourself.